This conference will now be recorded.
Greetings, everyone, again. Welcome to session number 12 of Brothers in Arms. And since these sessions are trying to cover the last week's daily Bible readings that Liberty is going through the Bible in chronological order. And so, since this is session number 12, that would correlate to this being the end of March. So, we're closing out the first quarter of the year. We're now into springtime, of course. It sure is that way here where we live in California. Nice warm days, cool nights, lots of flowers, lots of weeds, lots of everything, lots of pollen in the air for people with allergies. And so we're closing out the Torah, the writings of Moses, the first five books of the Old Testament, and going into the book of Joshua, the first 11 chapters of Joshua. So it's kind of sad leaving the writings of Moses because they're so rich and he's such a major character in the Bible. But as the Bible does, it keeps going from major character to major character and it highlights them, the good and the bad. And as great as they all were, Hebrews 11 talks about all of them, or most of them. Uh, and yet, chapter 12 of Hebrews basically is saying, without a chapter division, uh, you are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, of which we are going through right now with Moses and Joshua and so forth, into David and all of them. But we are to look unto Jesus, that he is the primary character of the whole Bible. He is what it is all headed to, both his first and second coming. And so while it's kind of sad to leave the writings of Moses and be talking about him very much, we look forward to Joshua and we look forward to the other characters to come. But it's all building up to the drama, to the apex, to the zenith character of the whole Bible, which is Jesus Christ. So, session number 12. So, I'll be covering the ending chapters of Deuteronomy mainly, and Steve will be focusing on the first 11 or so chapters of Joshua. Our text verse for all of these sessions that we get the idea of brothers in arms from is Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. So, as we consider the closing portion of Deuteronomy, starting with chapter 20 or 21 or so, and going to the end of the book, it really struck me, and I'm realizing this more and more. You say, "Well, you're 71 years old. You should have realized this at a much younger age," and I guess I did to a degree. But as you get older, I think you spend more time reflecting back on your studies through the years and what you've learned from the Bible, and things that you knew before become deeper. And one of the things that really stood out as we went through the first five books of the Old Testament is how wrong we are in our general view of the law of Moses, to see them as such a heavy burden, so difficult, kind of negative, kind of almost like a punishment. When you start reading through the laws, God is establishing a nation in a land, so they need a structure to go by. They need government framework to operate as a nation. And so that the purpose of so many of these laws is just for them to operate well as a nation, to be prosperous financially, spiritually, physically. And how so many of these laws are have um, a principle or an element of fairness in them. And you go through these chapters of 21 about unsolved murders and female captives and the rights of the firstborn. And What do you do when you have a rebellious son? Laws of sexual morality, those who are excluded from the congregation. Even in chapter 23, verses 9 through 14, I mean, just it's interesting that something like this is included about uh, covering up after yourself uh, when you eliminate food through your digestive system. Uh, Take care of it away from where you live, away from uh, other people, uh, cover it up with dirt, earth, and you think, why does he go into, why does he do that, something like that? But uh, it's he's so far ahead of other civilizations. And how long did it really take us? And some of this through history was known in medicine and so forth, but it's really in the last couple of centuries that we began to understand things like the transmission of germs and bacteria and disease uh, because of unsanitary conditions. I mean, it wasn't that far back into history that surgeons began to understand washing with soap, washing with something that kills the germs and bacteria between surgeries uh, would knock down the transmission of disease um, just because of sanitary conditions. And so God's incorporating this into them that just by practicing these kinds of practical things of cleaning up after yourself, after you eliminate through your digestive system, the uh, side benefit of lessening the transmission of disease and germs and so forth, causing people to be sick and even die. God was just building into their daily operation a system that would keep them healthier physically. And then, of course, a lot of these had to do with, you could really place all of these under the two categories of the two great commandments, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. Because a lot of these have to do with loving your neighbor as yourself. And your neighbor includes your family, includes your actual neighbors, those who live close to you. It includes the other citizens of the nation, and even includes the strangers. It's called the foreigners who come into, maybe even want to settle down in your country. And the underlying principle of all of it is the second great commandment. In other words, just treat people fairly, treat them honestly, don't try to deceive or trick them to gain financially from them. Uh, be kind to them, be honest in your business dealings with them. Uh, so all of these laws, because we don't see ourselves as a literal nation like Israel living in a piece of land operating under a system of government, of theocracy, the laws that God gave, because we tend to see these laws more in a negative light of how they weren't able to keep them. And so then they were to ask God for grace and mercy to forgive them when they broke the laws and to help them. And all of that also was a part of the law system. God was purposely designing it in a way that they would continually acknowledge they needed God's mercy and grace and forgiveness and help. So that's a big part of it. But that's in our day that seems to be the main emphasis of how a lot of people look at the law of Moses system. But if you were them living as a nation, you would come to understand that these laws are intended to keep us healthy physically, to help us to grow spiritually, to help us to draw closer to God, to help us to look to Him for every single thing that we do during the day, to learn how to treat our neighbors and family properly with respect and love and kindness, how to deal with those who come among us. Um, and for them, it was intended to be more of a positive effect, and we don't think about that part near as often as we should, trying to put ourselves into their place. I don't know if you
We
want to.
tend to, yeah, we tend to think about all those laws too as being laws that would lead unto death, and there was just a handful that would lead unto some type of action that they would be stoned to death, for instance. But the majority of them had to do with, as you mentioned so clearly, that setting them up as a successful society, a healthy society, a society that would be different than the nations around them. And so, when we think about, if we're not careful, we just think about the laws. We kind of think about this as 600 and something laws that they could die if they broke any of them. And that was not the case at all. In fact, we talked about last week, after the law was read and given, that it was for their good. It was mentioned, recorded. So it was for their good, for their benefit. So we can learn from those too.
When we get to chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, this is that great long chapter of the blessings of obedience and the curses on disobedience. And it is interesting. It's kind of like the works of the flesh and the fruit of the spirit. The works of the flesh in Galatians 5 is a much longer list than the fruit of the spirit, because the fruit of the spirit can be narrowed down to just a handful of things that cause blessing in your life, whereas there are many more things that can do you harm in the works of the flesh. And so chapter 28 of Deuteronomy is kind of like that, where the blessings are only the first 14 verses, and then the curses on disobedience cover the rest of the chapter. 68 verses 15 through 68 is mainly talking about the warnings, the dangers, the curses that can come on you in disobedience. So, Paul talked about in Second Corinthians, First Corinthians, the being removed from the simplicity of Christ, and the simplicity of serving Christ is not supposed to be complicated, complex, impossible to understand. It's the fruit of the Spirit. But the world system that can do us a lot of harm in our Christian life is multitude in number. And so it's expressed in this chapter, the difference in the length of the blessings on obedience and the curses on disobedience. One of the things that really stands out to me in this chapter 28, the first 14 verses, blessings on obedience, is I call it what could have been. And this gets into kind of a controversial, it shouldn't be controversial, but it is, because it's hard for our natural mind to understand. We tend to think that everything had to happen the way it did, leading up to the coming of Christ and his death and resurrection. But it's hard for us to wrap our heads around how different history would have been if Israel had obeyed God with a circumcision of heart approach, a humble obedience and love. Because you read these verses and you have to ask yourself the question, do they really mean what they say? It says that they will overtake you. It says in verse 1 that if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. Well, is that a true promise or not? So Evidently, if they would have obeyed God from their heart, they would not have gone into Assyrian captivity or Babylonian captivity or ruled over by the Greeks, by the Persians, by the Romans. Now, how God would have worked all that out is up to him. His wisdom is up to the task. It wouldn't have been difficult for him. He always prefers obedience rather than disobedience. Christ would have still had to die. Uh, if they had obeyed him, then they would have properly understood their need for their Messiah coming as a suffering servant to die on their behalf. It was in their disobedience that they did not understand it. That's what the Gospels describe. But in their obedience, they would have understood the necessity of his death and resurrection. And God would have worked all those details out just fine. It says in verse 2:28, all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, the offspring of your flocks. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed you shall be when you come in, and blessed shall be when you go out. There would not have been droughts, or if there had been in some way, God would have done for them and with them what Joseph did in Egypt, saved up ahead of time so that they had plenty during the years of droughts. Uh, so they would have never had to go hungry. They would never had needed to have scarcity. It says in verse 7, the Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face. They should come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. Well, would that have been true or not? So the course of history could have been much different. And, we're going to read later in Joshua. Steve gets into some things in Joshua. And then even in Chronicles and Kings and Samuel, uh, some of their major victories over armies much bigger than them. The story of Gideon in the book of Judges. That would have been the normal course. With his 300, he would, how many times larger were the Midianite army than his? Uh, so, there's a number of those kind of examples. Well, this would have been commonplace. Verse 7 would have been. They would have never gone into exile or captivity. Um, unless you say that God purposely wanted them to be disobedient. He wanted them to rebel. I mean, he prophesied that they would. He knew their nature, but that's different than making them rebel or disobey. As we get through into chapter 30, the choice of life or death. I mean, that chapter is so great because starting in verse 11 through 20, he says, I set before you life and death. But he says, my desire is that you choose life. Well, is that true or not? So we need to be careful to say that God purposely designed that they rebel and disobey and go into captivity so that he could deliver them, so that they could be uh, found empty and sinners and so forth when Christ came the first time. Um, Jesus said at the end of Matthew 23, how often I wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. I was willing, but you were not willing. So he puts all the blame on them. And this idea of, and this gets into a real sticky area about prophecy, is that God did prophesy that they would rebel. He did prophesy that they would need to be corrected and punished, even to go into exile and captivity. But people tend to think because he prophesied it is the same as he predestined it. And that's not necessarily so. Uh, He prophesied it because he knew what would happen. It doesn't mean he predestined it to be that way. All the way through, he's basically begging them, listen to me, hear me, obey me, humble yourselves before me. I want to bless you. I don't want all these terrible things to come on you. Um, and so this chapter 28, especially like verse 9, the Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Then all the peoples of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. This was God's desire, is that they be a witness to the nations that their God is the only true God, and that they're being blessed because they're obeying him. And then that would cause others to at least be curious about, maybe I should consider giving myself to their God. And this never came to pass because they didn't follow this obedience. Uh, then of course the curses on disobedience, and so much of what the rest of this chapter talks about was their history, but only because they disobeyed God. And then in chapter 30, before he gets to that choose life over death, uh, he's saying in verse 1, it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind. In other words, the beginning of repentance among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice, according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you. So even in their disobedience, if they repent, turn back to God, he will forgive them and have compassion on them. He will gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. Uh, it says in verse 5, then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you, multiply you more than your fathers. He's a very loving and forgiving father. He wants to bless them, even if he has to put them under the rod of correction at different times. It says in verse 6, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. And then he goes on to talk about the blessings that he wants to give them. Verse 10, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in the book of this law, and if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So God's desire for them, but the reality of it is, as he prophesied and said to them, you are going to disobey me, and I will have to punish you and send you into captivity, but that's not really what I want. What could have been is a real interesting question to ask. I will read a couple of verses over in Psalm 81. That, and there's a lot of verses that say this, so I'm not just making this up. He says in Psalm 81 in verse 13, oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have, see, this is what could have been. He would have fed them also with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you. He would have done this if they obeyed him. And uh, we don't need to struggle with the idea of how history would have been different. It would have been different, but it would have been better because God always desires obedience over disobedience. Now, back that those blessings on obedience in chapter 28, verses 1 through 14, and then chapter 30, the first part, that if you turn back to the Lord, I will bless you as I wanted to all along. All of that will be true in the millennial. Many verses talk about that they will be a holy, righteous nation and never rebel against him again during that 1,000 years. And so all of these blessings that he talks about here will be true for a literal nation of Israel during the millennial. So these promises will be seen, and the effects to the other nations of the earth will be a reality. Before I get into chapter 32, do you have anything to say on that?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking about what could have been, we get glimpses of that as what could have been is the 12 that were called that were of Israel, the 120, the 5,000, so the early church. That's what could have been. And, at least we would say that 120 were definitely already saved, baptized followers of Christ, yet he still had to go die. So it wouldn't have stopped. It didn't. If they would have believed, it wouldn't have stopped the necessity of him needing to die for sins. So that still would have happened. But the outcome for them could have been very different. And you read in Psalm 81, kind of reminded me of Luke 19, and a nobleman desiring and called his servants and delivered to them some money and said, do business until I come. Some were faithful, some were not, most were not. So again, with that thought of what could have been, could have looked very different for them.
That's a good point.
And will in the future.
Yeah. So there was always an elect remnant. God always had a faithful elect remnant within the nation, but he desired that the whole nation be holy. I mean, he set them up as to be a holy nation. And they got close to it a few times, but they couldn't keep it. And so that elect remnant is called the wheat in Matthew 3. And so he took the wheat out of the nation and formed the church. And but God wanted more than an elect remnant. And so in the millennial, the elect remnant will be the whole nation. And for 1,000 years, the nations will have to admit that when God gave the promise to Abram in Genesis 12 of making them a holy nation, a special treasure in Exodus 19, he meant it, and he's able to do it, and he will do it for 1,000 years, and that will be a great witness to the nations. I just want to say a few things about Deuteronomy 32. We could spend the whole session. I've taught on this quite a bit through the years. I have several lengthy papers that I'd be glad to send to you. I've sent them out through the years on Deuteronomy 32, because this is the song of Moses just before he died, and he was told to teach it to them. And the thing about songs is it makes memorization easier. So many of us talk about in church the songs we grew up with, and sometimes we'll hear a song or we'll bring up a song to sing that we haven't sang maybe in 20 years or 30 years or something, since we were kids even, and the words come right back to us. There's just something about a song that makes memorization easier. And so he wrote this prophecy in chapter 32. It's called the Song of Moses, but it's really a prophecy. And I call this chapter 32, I call it the headwaters prophetic chapter, or the fountainhead. The single verse that is the fountainhead or headwaters of prophecy is Genesis 3:15. The two seeds, the continual conflict between Christ and Antichrist, between God and Satan, between good and evil, and the people who align themselves with each one, is all contained within Genesis 3:15, and the rest of the Bible is the outworking of that, concluding with the victory of the seed of the woman over the seed of the serpent. And so that's the condensed prophecy found in one verse. But the single chapter that does the same thing and gives more details is Deuteronomy 32. And it's a sweeping view of Israel way into her future, because he says in verse 29 of chapter 31, "For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt," and they did, "and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you." And that's kind of their whole history, is a history of rebellion, a history of disobedience. And so all those promises of obedience that he wanted to give them never happened, at least completely, because they did not live up to that. And so he knows it's just going to be kind of a recurring theme through their history of rebellion, and then often repentance, and then forgiveness, and God restores and gives them a deliverer, and then they go through the same cycle over and over. And it says, "And evil will befall you in the latter days." That's a real key phrase in the Old Testament, in the latter days. So he's basically saying that this song I'm teaching you is going to talk about your entire future all the way to the end, which we call the second coming of Christ and the millennial. "And because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands." So Moses spoke at the hearing of all the assembly of Israel the words of this song till they were all ended. And it's just a beautiful song. It's a beautiful prophecy. Um, and but it's also an indictment against them ahead of time. So he says in verse 5, "They have corrupted themselves." He speaks as if it's already done, because this is a song they're supposed to repeat through their future, which means in their continual rebellion, they're going to be able to say it in the past tense, because that's what they're living through. "They have corrupted themselves. They are not his children because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation." This was a spirit that remained in them all the way to the time of the first coming of Christ, and it manifested itself in them saying, "Crucify him, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar." John
Hey,
19:50.
Rick.
Yeah,
Hey, before you go too far into the
yeah.
song, I just wanted to mention in the 31st chapter, when the Lord was telling Moses, he said, "Therefore write down this song." So it feels like to me it's a song taught to him by the Lord, or at minimum it's inspired him by the Lord. So write this song down for yourself and teach it to the children of Israel. So that's what you're going on to speak about, and put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness. So here's the song. Some of the main purpose of the song is it may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. But at minimal, whether Moses came up with the words of the song or not, I would definitely use that verse to say he was inspired or given the inspiration by God to write this song.
Yeah, and it's such an important song that it's going to be sung by the saints in Revelation 15:2 through 4. They're going to sing the song of Moses. So we need to put the importance on this song that the Bible does, that even at the end, leading up to the return of Christ, and after the return of Christ, evidently Christ is going to be singing this with the saints. So the God who gave this to Moses, is going to end up singing it with the saints in his return. And as you said, is written by his direct command, probably directly worded by God and taught to them. Um, and this ongoing spirit of verse 5, chapter 32, really gives us a clue when Jesus said in Matthew 24:34 that all these things shall come upon this generation. And that's a real controversial verse. But I'm thinking one thing it means is that at the return of Christ, this spirit of rebellion that was embedded in them is finally going to be removed. And they will no longer be a disobedient nation anymore. So take that for what it's worth if you want to think about that. It is interesting, like in verse 6, I always like these kind of progression ideas that is often in the Bible. The last part of verse 6, is he not your father who bought you, made you, and established you? So they kind of build on each other. And then verse 7 through 9 is we don't quite know what to make of it. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. So there's something about the destiny of the nations are closely bound up with Israel. It's kind of a mystery description here. And it goes back to where he talks about, I'll make you the head of the nations if you're obedient. I'll make you the tail if you're not obedient. But even whether they're the head or the tail, the nations are kind of bound up. And, we're living now in 2026. All these hundreds, thousands of years later, Israel is still kind of the heartbeat of the nation. That what Israel does affects all the nations of the earth. Even in our day, God predicted this kind of thing all the way back in the Song of Moses. There's just a lot in this. If you want my studies on this, my documents, just email me and I'll be glad to send them out. It's just a lot of prophecy. God is described as a rock at least 5 times in this chapter. Some great things said about God as their rock. And of course, Paul describes this rock as the rock that followed them was Christ. So that the theme of God as a rock or a solid stone, a firm foundation, is carried over into the New Testament. Verses like Matthew 16:18, I will build this church on this rock. So the idea of something that is solid, something that is lasting. Well, let me see. There's verse 34 is an interesting verse. Is this not laid up in store with me, sealed among my treasures? That's the language of mystery. It's kind of a description of a mystery. It's a truth that's sealed up among my treasures. It's laid up in store, and then it's revealed at a particular time. So, embedded in this song is just a lot of large truths that are developed later in the Bible. Then he goes on to talk about vengeance, and that's going to happen at the return of Christ. It says, vengeance is mine, a recompense, their foot shall slip in due time. For the day of their calamity is at hand. The day of their calamity. That is the time of Jacob's trouble. The calamity and tribulation is the same idea. There's going to come in the latter days a day of calamity, and all the things to come hasten upon them. And so he's really going down to the end of the story. As it says in verse 36, the Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone. This is such an important verse. Just like any of us, the moment we were saved, we were not saved until our power was gone. Romans chapter 5 says, for in due time Christ died for the ungodly, for when we were without strength, when we had no power, is when Christ stepped in and saved us. And every one of us who have had that experience, we know exactly what that means, is when we totally surrendered, we gave up on ourselves, our power was gone, And that's when his compassion stepped in and saved us. And he's going to do the same thing to the nation here. He's going to wait till their power is gone. So right now, during the taping of this session, Israel is fighting against Iran, and the U.S. is assisting them. And it seems like Israel is unbeatable. But if prophecy is correct as we understand it, there must come a time when Israel's power is totally gone and they become totally dependent upon the Lord, and they repent. Their power is completely gone. And just like when we were saved, they will reach out to him in repentance and humility, and he will save them. So verse 36 is a very rich, deep prophetic verse about the future salvation of Israel. There's a verse in Daniel chapter 12, before I finish out Deuteronomy 32, and let Steve have a little bit to say here in this session in the book of Joshua. But Daniel chapter 12 and verse 7 says the same thing. At the end of verse 7, and when the power, it's interesting that that word power is the same word for power in Deuteronomy 32:36. It's literally the word for hand in Hebrew, yod, and that's where our strength is. So hand is the idea of strength. And when the power or strength of the holy people has been completely shattered, in other words, when their strength is gone, and so somehow they're going to have to be shattered in the future, leading to their conversion. And we don't know how all this is going to turn out, but it's going to have to turn around in some way to where the nations will be gathered against Israel. So Deuteronomy 32 is such a rich prophetic chapter. And in verse 37, he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices, drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise and help you and be your refuge. Now see that I, even I, am he. There is no God beside me. I kill, I make alive, I wound, I heal. Nor is there anyone who can deliver from my hand. For I raise my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I whet my glittering sword. So this is talking about his defeat of his enemies at his return. That great sword that goes out of his mouth in Revelation 19 and destroys his enemies. And it's Zechariah 14, that when all the nations come against Israel, it says the Lord shall fight for them as he fought in the day of battle, and he shall defeat them. So this is very end time language going through the remainder of this chapter. But I do like how it ends, verse 43. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land and his people. So in the midst of his vengeance is the rescue and salvation of his people Israel, and not just the people, but the land of the people. One of the reasons why we are premillennial in our view of the end times and the future is because we believe that the land promise, a literal piece of land promise given to them, is exactly what he meant. And the atonement is not just for our people here, but for his land. That is something that's very solid, something that's very real. It's not symbolic. It's not, can't spiritualize it or allegorize it away. He will rescue them and place them in their own promised land, and let them live as the head of the nations for 1,000 years with the glorified bride made up of faithful saints of the ages, assisting Christ in the operation of that government and supervising over the nation of Israel as they operate as the head of the nation. So let Deuteronomy 32 be as deep and rich as the Lord wants it to be for you. And there's a lot you can gain by a deep study of this chapter. And that's all I'm going to say on these, because I've taken up more than my share of the time. Sorry. And Steve wants to bring up some things in the book of Joshua, because today we've covered through chapter 11. And what would you like to bring up as we transition from Moses to Joshua?
You brought some thoughts in that Song of Moses that seem very parallel to the book of Joshua, to where, you know, the Battle of Jericho seemed quite easy. And the next little battle, when they thought they were going to win it with Ai because they had sin in their camp, and Israel in disobedience even today, that what seemed like a small nation or small group of people defeated them. And so Israel seems like they are unbeatable right now, but it seems like we just, as we go through the Bible, we just see history played out over and over again and again and again. Wanted to talk a little bit about Joshua the book of Joshua, and maybe about his name for a few minutes before we get into the book of Joshua. His original name in Numbers 13, and then being one of the 12 spies sent in, his name was Hoshea. But in the 13th chapter, in the 16th verse, Moses starts calling him Yehoshua, and I'm really messing that up. So his name, Hoshea, just means salvation, but Moses added on Yahweh is salvation. So he's expanding on Joshua's name, a little bit of insight maybe from Moses of how God's going to use Joshua moving forward. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it's just the Hebrew equivalent, or the Greek equivalent to the name Jesus. So, you know, the Hebrew name Jesus, that we use Jesus, could be called Joshua. We could use the name Joshua and intertwine that back and forth and be accurate. So a thought kind of came to me about Moses wanted to lead them in, but was able to only see the land, could only lead them so far, but it was Joshua or Jesus that had to lead them in to the promised land. Maybe some thoughts there that in a devotional thought or setting could be shared about only the men of God, men very specifically used by God, can bring us along, but we still can't enter in. And we have to be our entering involves Joshua or involves Jesus, and we can't bypass that, no matter what the desire is of those that are teaching us. So the book of Joshua picks right up after Moses dies, so about 1400 BC, 1405 is a date that I saw. But in the first chapter of Joshua, I think it's very encouraging. I mean, these definitely are springboard thoughts and verses. As the Lord spoke to Joshua and just said, "As I was with Moses, I will be with you." What a great thought. What a great thing to hear from the Lord. But what a weighty thing to hear from the Lord. We only think of maybe the blessing side of that, but it's the responsibility piece too. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. You will be leading my people. And it's a huge responsibility. So I want you to listen clearly to what I say and what Moses said, and don't turn to the left, don't turn to the right. Specifically, walk in the path that I have set before you. So, you know, again, as I was with Moses, I'll be with you. That's kind of warm and fuzzy on the surface, but the responsibility piece is huge. Be strong and of good courage. Statements like "do not turn from the left or to the right," as I've already mentioned from the law. And the book of law shall not depart from your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night. What a great thought for us to consider when we think about the Word of God. And the Lord tells him, in doing that, for then your way will be prosperous. Your way will be prosperous by listening and hearing and doing what I'm telling you to do, what Moses instructed you to do. Any thoughts so far just on those
No,
few things?
that's real good. He's telling Joshua the key to success. If you want success, here's what you need to do: be strong, very courageous. And Joshua had already proven himself that. But God is basically saying, what you proved 38 years ago at Kadesh when you went in with the 12 spies, and you and Caleb are now alive because you brought back a good report, and everyone else your age are dead. So Joshua's looking around at these people thinking, man, me and Caleb are quite a bit older than anyone else. But God is kind of saying to him, that was 38 years ago, and you did good and you're still alive. But that's no guarantee you still have that same spirit of courage and obedience to me. Just make sure that you continue that you had way back there, because it's really a good lesson about you can't rest on your laurels. You can't say, well, I was a strong church member Christian 38 years ago, and so that's going to carry me the rest of my life. No, we don't live our Christian life by a reputation of what we did a long time ago. We are to continue our walk of faith and godly courage to the very end, and not rely on some victory that we had many years ago. It's every day is a new battle. Every day is a test of our faith, an opportunity to grow in faith, and we're not to slack off. And I think Joshua understood what God was saying, and throughout the book of Joshua, he proved that he still had that same spirit. He and Caleb both.
Mm-hmm. And some of the benefits of learning from what feels like maybe negative things happen. I mean, he definitely would have remembered Miriam and Aaron not entering, and Aaron's sons and what they did. He was real close to what Moses had done, and only getting to look but not go in. So again, the responsibility piece that God was giving him was huge. So the book tells us about the conquering, entering, and occupying the land of Canaan by the hand of the Lord. And I think that's an important key phrase that could be underlined: by the hand of the Lord. They had to learn a lot of hard lessons, and one very important one was that they couldn't conquer the land, and those people by their own strength, or only by their sheer numbers, or by their military strategy, even though Joshua used military strategy. But I think, again, directed by God, God told him to go. I'm going to give these people to you, and led Joshua. Joshua was a vessel to accomplish the Lord's will and to be the speaker between the Lord and the people. So that hard lesson that they learned early and quickly in AI, that we must move forward with in the exact manner and precise manner of how the Lord tells us to go. And this is not because of, again, our strength or who we are. He's promised us the land. Let's go in and just take it without any having to fight. They had to do their part. But there are many times already in the book of Joshua to where we're going to read, or where we've already read, to where there were more killed by God on that day with hailstones in one occasion than there was with a sword. So it is the Lord's battle. Can you imagine what these warriors came home and said to their families when they were in some of these battles, and they saw the hand of the Lord so clearly, that the enemy's laying dead and they've been killed by hailstones from God as we were chasing them? Anyway, just kind of moving forward in the thoughts there. It's just great things read in the book of Joshua that we can parallel to the victories that we've experienced in our life, and we know it was the hand of the Lord in doing that.
So that killing more by hailstones than by the sword was to reinforce to Israel that make sure you know that I'm the one doing all this. And this is a reminder to you that even though you're fighting, it's not because you're such great fighters or because of your own ingenuity. I mean, even with Ai, it was God who told them how to set that trap to win that battle. So it's letting them know that I'm the one directing all of this, and you need to realize that I'm the power behind what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about Jericho just for a minute, but I kind of want to talk about it, and you could do a much better job in that because of all the end time studies that you've done over the years and provided even thoughts for all of us. But I wanted to kind of talk about just for a minute the victory at Jericho and the similarities to the return of Christ and the victory over the future destruction of that great city, Babylon, a walled city that seems like it would be unpenetratable. Revelation 18:10. So we think about the Battle of Jericho, and we all know it. In Revelations 18:10, when I was talking about Babylon, in 1 hour judgment has come. They were annihilated. Babylon was a representative of a strong city, but at the Lord's return, it's going to be destroyed quickly, very quickly. So I think we can look at that at Jericho, how 7 days before the total destruction, it was a strong walled city that the city-states around it recognized. It was strategic in even its location. When I start looking at some information, it is where the crossings would be. It would be where in the, at this time when they're crossing in the springtime, it's overflowing its banks. But much of the time it was the areas that could be crossed because it wasn't very deep. In fact, when we read about the spies and they went out to try to find those spies, they ran to those areas instead, to the fjords, to the areas that are typically low enough to cross. But I didn't want to talk about that too much right now. I just wanted to say that in 1 hour judgment has come. So some of the parallels that we might think about to the return of Christ. It was a wicked city. It was a city in Canaan. And if you want to do some studies about the Canaanites, the people of Canaan, which included all the other ites, very wicked people, very wicked culture. And, Jericho was that kind of city. And so some of the other parallels just to think about, the two spies who were also the two witnesses. So the two spies came back and they were witnesses. And so we have two witnesses in the return of prior to the return of Christ. Those two witnesses were delivered from death 3 days after those that sought to kill them. So they were saved from that, but in 3 days they were delivered from that and were able to go back to Joshua and the children of Israel. Then the commander appears to Joshua with a drawn sword. His sword is drawn. I mean, when I read about the commander, it felt like Revelation to me. and our commander coming with a sword drawn, ready to do battle. And John fell at the feet of the messenger in Revelation, and so did Joshua fall at the feet of this commander, which was, in my mind, that's Jesus in the Old Testament appearing as the commander before Joshua. Then we have all the sevens, and this is where you could really expand on this thought, is the blowing of the trumpets, the long sound of the trumpets, the seventh day, the 7 times around, the 7 bowls of Revelations, the 7 trumpets of Revelation, the 7th trump of Revelation. At the 7th trump, the commander comes and that great Babylon is destroyed and is burnt up. But before it's burnt up, just like Rahab was told to come out of that city, and she did, and her family was saved out of that city. There's opportunity for all people to come out of that great Babylon and be saved through obedience. But even with Rahab expressed to the spies her great faithfulness, and the faithfulness came from a statement you said earlier that Israel was to be a witness to the nations. The victories they were going to have were to be a witness to the nations. There were few people like Rahab that stated, "We heard what you did to those nations and to those kings, and our hearts melted." And Rahab chose to be a believer in the Lord because of what she had heard had happened. And she was given instruction to obey and stay in the house. But what about her family? She says, when this happens, what about my father, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters? And they said, as long as they're in the house, they will be saved. And they were. But I did want to mention, I did notice that in the 6th chapter, so she asked that in the 2nd chapter. In the 6th chapter of Joshua, it does not mention her sisters when they went in and delivered them. 6:23 says, and the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. I don't know if I want to read too much into this, but when the ask included their sisters, the actual event doesn't include her sisters. I wonder if her sisters were because they were in their husband's houses and not in Rahab's house at that time. And if her brothers were in her house, surely their wives and their families would be there too. So we don't know how many. But a thought that I wanted to, that I thought about was, if they marched around that city those 7 days, and for 6 days they blew the trumpet long and loud, and on the 7th day 7 times, we know that Rahab expressed her faith when the spies were there. We don't know about her family. But when we think about the end times and all the sevens, the 7 days, there's opportunity. If her parents and her brothers did not believe like she did when the spies were there and she expressed her faith, with the blowing of the trumpets, is that when they became believers? Is that when they said, what must we do to be saved? Type statement. And she said, you need to believe what I say is true, and you need to stay in the house. And if you stay in the house, you're going to be saved. And, an extension of that would be, my thought would be in the New Testament, well, throughout the entire Bible, it's repent, believe, and be baptized, and stay in the house. And if you do, the providential care of God will be upon you, even though a lot of sevens are happening at the same time. So I kind of thought, as I was reading this whole story about the sevens and the trumpets and the blowing and the 7 times around, and also at on the 7th day they were to shout, and at the return of Christ, he's coming with his saints, and there's going to be a great shout, a great noise. So there's just a lot of things, and I think you've probably brought a few of these things up in your end time study, but it just seemed to stand out to me as I was reading through this story this time. It felt like I was reading Revelation to some degree. What do you think?
Oh boy, excellent. I don't know that I could really add much to what you said. Those were some really good connections to Revelation and the end times. Joshua, in some ways, is a type of Christ in his second coming. Moses, maybe more Christ in his first coming. The leader, the giving of the law, leading out of Egypt, deliverance. All those great things about Moses would more apply to Christ at his first coming. And then the things about Joshua defeating the enemies, settling the land, bringing peace and prosperity to them as a nation is more about Christ at his second coming. And it does take both Moses and Joshua to really give us a complete picture of Christ in both of his comings. So the applications you made, I think, are very accurate, and some of those I'd never brought out before, but I think they fit very well. And Joshua being their leader, it's so interesting. Like you said, he bowed down before that vision of that commander. So into the idea of Christ being obedient to his Father, seeing himself as a servant, even though he was God in the flesh. And because of that, God has highly lifted him up, given him a name above every name. And so I think it's very fitting that the name Joshua in the Old Testament is the same as Jesus in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good to leave it at that. There are those who claim that if you don't pronounce it Yeshua, because the letter J is kind of a late development in history, that you're pronouncing his name wrong and therefore showing disrespect, and he's not going to bless you or honor your prayers. But we need to be careful about those kind of things. We're talking about Hebrew and Greek and English, and language develops and changes through time. And so if you call his name Jesus and Joshua instead of Yeshua, or Yehoshua, and then, because in that sacred names movement, that's part of the Hebrew roots movement, they split and divide and argue and fuss with each other about exactly how to pronounce Yahweh and Yeshua. And if you don't have the right number of vowels, if you don't emphasize the right syllable, if you don't spell it exactly right, then you're dishonoring God or you're dishonoring Christ. I think God sees through all that, and we call his son's name Jesus instead of Yeshua. I have a feeling he's just glad that we call on him and are trying to serve him, and not so much if we pronounce his name exactly the way it should be from Hebrew and Greek into English. So anyway, Joshua and Jesus being the same name, meaning God is my salvation, or God is salvation. So Joshua was their deliverer in that sense, and Christ Jesus is our deliverer. So, but yeah, those connections to the second coming are really great. I think you wanted to bring up some
Not
things about the stones also. Is that right?
well, just quickly, because I have a couple more thoughts, just devotional type thoughts again. So
Okay.
maybe this could be lessons for sure. Back to the Jericho story and all the sevens and the similarities to the return of Christ. I think it'd be an interesting exercise sometime in a class setting, just to, get a whiteboard out or something, and just have a class full of people that are talking about the similarities and what that could mean. And I think the list would get much longer than I had already
Well, you brought up
presented.
about a dozen or so, it seemed. But yeah, there's probably more, but I
Mm.
really like the ones you brought out.
Yeah, we've gone through, especially in the book of Joshua before at Liberty, we've talked quite a bit about the stones and the memorial stones, we could call them, how many times they were set up and various reasons they were set up. Monuments, we could even call them today. The first one we read about in Joshua that I looked at anyway was at the crossing of the Jordan. And that's in the 4th chapter, but Joshua is instructed by the Lord to have one man from each tribe pick up a stone out of the middle of the river and to carry it over on their shoulders. So this was a big stone, and put it in the camp that night to where they're going to camp. And they eventually set that up. But at the same time, in that same chapter, Joshua sets up 12 stones in the middle of the river, which they were on dry land, and the priests were there. Let me look at my notes here real quick. The priests were in the middle of the river. The stones were set up as a heap. The law and Aaron's rod that budded was in the ark of the covenant, and all representative of Christ. All of those represent Christ very easily for us to run to some verses that talk very specifically about that being Christ. And but my thought that came to my mind was, you've mentioned multiple times to us that this was the area to where John was baptizing, and it probably is the area where Jesus was baptized. I feel like this time reading through that, and the Lord having Joshua set up those stones in the middle of the river, I kind of want to believe that's the exact place that John was baptizing.
Interesting.
That it meant something. Those stones, all those things that were in the middle of that river, were representative of who would be in the middle of that river in the future at its baptism. So just a thought. But we have multiple times, and I won't go exhaustive into it, but at least 5 times in our reading up to chapter 11, Joshua himself or Joshua has stones set up, sometime for a memorial to tell your children positive things. The Lord brought us here. The Lord brought us across the Jordan and so forth. So you'll tell your children important things about this for them to remember. But, he also set up stones, a heap of stones, after the incident of Achan. And so after they stoned Achan and those of his family, they set up a big heap of stones. So that was a memorial also. So it wasn't always just a memorial of warm and fuzzy. It's also a memorial to not repeat what they did. Remember Achan? This is, did somebody in the future write Achan on the top stone of that heap? I'm not sure, just for for a memorial. Then after the victory at Ai, Joshua built an altar. They piled up some stones, and that's tied up and tied in with what Moses told them to do when they came into the land in Deuteronomy 27, verses 1 through 8, where Moses said, when you come into the land, you're going to take 12 large stones, you're going to what would we say? Well, you're going to make them white with lime. So you're going to bleach them out with lime. Make them white, and you're going to write the entire law, entirety of the law. It didn't feel like to me they wrote all 613 laws, but at least they wrote maybe the 10 laws on these stones and piled them up. And so I think that's an interesting visual. So this was a completion of what Moses had told them to do. I think it was out at Mount Gerizim and Ebal. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Sounds like that's where they were to set those up. That's where Moses had instructed them to set it up. So they would look at those and remember. So I think that was interesting. And then after the 5 kings of the Amorites, when they defeated them, they threw them in the cave that they had been hiding in, that those 5 kings had been hiding in, and Joshua had them pile up a bunch of large stones at the entrance of that cave that is there to this day. Again, that would be for a memorial of don't be those 5 kings. But I did want to mention that those 5 kings said the same thing, basically the same thing that Rahab said. We have heard and we have saw what the Lord of the Israelites have done to these nations. And in fact, now the Gibeonites, which was a large group of people that had made peace with Israel, they're on their sides too. So those 5 kings, instead of doing what the Gibeonites did, and okay, we've heard that the Lord had told them to destroy us, but we have nothing to lose and everything to gain if we go beg to be servants, and maybe they'll let some of us live. So there's the altar call. There's the invitation, the opportunity for an invitation to become a slave and to not die. At least we can save our little ones, possibly. Instead, they rallied to try to kill them. And so it's the acceptance, it's hearing the word of God, the truth of God's word, and then what do you do with that? Do you rally and rebel against it, or do you try to ask for mercy? And possibly God will let your little ones and maybe your wives and children live, although we as the kings might be killed. And Joshua, if you read in our readings this week, man, Joshua, what he did to the kings was a very visual expression of we're not only killing your soldiers, we're killing your government. We are, this is a war against your culture, not just your people. And so another king can't rise up and rally the people. Now, that being said, kind of in closing, I did want to just throw out a thought, and this would be very controversial, about what seems to be maybe hyperbole language sometimes when we read about some of these things. And we can read examples of both happening, and that is total destruction, every man, woman, child, animal, very specifically state that in some of those battles. But in some of those battles, it doesn't seem to mention it as the extreme. And the reason I wanted to mention that is if it was total destruction of the people, I have to reconcile why God gave them instruction when you go into the land, do not intermarry with their children, and do not make any business arrangements with them, and so forth. If there's not going to be a people, if you're going to annihilate them 100%, there would be no need to mention don't marry them, unless that was all part of the same idea. You're going to annihilate them, and you're not going to marry them, and you're not going to make business dealings with them. Anyway, that the hyperbole language also is how I can reconcile in my mind that even David had to fight with some of these people 400 years later. So they weren't completely annihilated, even in some cases when it appears that they were. And so maybe the hyperbole language can help me state that when you kill their kings and you kill all their leaders, you kill their armies, the idea is you have killed them and you've killed their culture. Any thoughts on that?
No, that's good. I think you're right on track on that. I was also thinking when you mentioned that altar, that stone memorial that he set up between the two mountains, the blessings and the curses, is exactly the same place when Abram first came into the land, and the very first altar he built was right there at Shechem, which is in the middle of those two mountains. And so I wonder, Joshua would know that. That'd be a historical marker that he would know. And so, in his mind, what deep meaning it would have had for him to place that at the same place, or very near the same place that Abram built his first altar when he came into the land. And now 500 years later, they're back in the land to conquer it and settle it down, just as God promised to Abram would happen. They're going to go be slaves in a nation they don't belong to, but I'm going to bring them out. And it's going to take that long, over 400 years, because I want to make sure the iniquity of the Amorites, the sins of the people of Canaan, reach a place to where they all become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so I will be justified in wiping them all out. And just kind of a confirmation of all that to Joshua is to be right there where where Abram first set up his first altar when he came into the land. It's kind of like a renewal of that promise. It's like settling it in Joshua's mind and heart that what your father Abram did 500 years ago, I'm reestablishing those same promises to you, and you're in the process of bringing it all about. So, to us, but to Joshua, it carried very, very deep meaning to him, knowing that history of that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to kind of close real quick, mentioning about the Gibeonites. We can be all over the place on what we think about what they did, but what they did preserve their lives and the lives of their children and improve their life by being a servant to the house of Israel with strict instructions on how the Israelites were supposed to treat their servants. they had a good life, and even when the 5 kings came against Gibeah, um, they were able to call on Joshua and say, "Hey, we're your servants. Come help us." And so, very beneficial. And I tried to look up I did look up just a few verses about the future of the Gibeonites and what's mentioned about the land, and that's where Solomon was at when he offered to God a sacrifice, and God met with him and asked him, "What can I do for you as a king?" And so that's where Solomon was blessed by God, because he didn't ask for riches and wealth and fame and all that stuff. He asked for wisdom. And God says, "Well, I'm going to give you even more than that." So it was at Gibeah. So again, it just seems like if that wasn't allowed by God, if there was, God's mercy, I see God's mercy in that, instead of just a title in my Bible about the failure, of the Israelites getting tricked, basically, is the thought. That it's, for one thing, God used the Gibeonites right off the bat for those 5 kings to come up against them, and for Joshua then be able to go kill 5 kings at one time in an early battle of their conquest, of their 7-year conquest. So anyway, just kind of a thought. I put them in more of a positive light than a negative light for what they did.
Yeah, and to extend it, as you have been, to the end times, to the future, the Gibeonites might represent those servant nations during the millennial to God's people, that they're not destroyed, they're not like unbelievers that are cast away, but they serve a good purpose. And God blesses them by sparing their life, letting them be servants to the bride or to the holy nation. So it kind of fits into that, what some of us call that third destiny of the saved of the nations, to walk in the light of the city, but very probably their role will to be honored servants of the bride. And so they will look at it as a blessing rather than a curse or a punishment. So I think there's something there to be applied to the future also. Okay,
That's
well,
what I
we
have.
covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts?
Enjoyed the thoughts you brought out. And
Well, as well as
always,
you what time I spent in Deuteronomy 32 about it being such a prophetic chapter, you applied that principle to the readings in Joshua. So that worked out well. I didn't realize it was going to be that closely connected. Anyway, thank you, everyone. We've completed session number 12 and on to number 13 next time as we complete the book of Joshua and move into that dreaded, dark, sad book of Judges. So we'll try
maybe
to
you'll change your mind by the time we get through it.
Yeah, maybe we'll actually share some of the more positive aspects of the book of Judges. Anyway, thank you, everyone. God bless. Until next session.